So I'm going to get kind of everything ready on the internet and kind of see where we're at and what questions are coming in. But before we get into those questions, I do want to let people know that on our Reason for Hope our YouTube page, there are 3 sermons that you did on Sunday, and they're all there available. I would recommend anybody listen to them. You did a Mother's Day kind of trifecta. Yeah. Wouldn't you say that? So why don't you kind of describe a little bit about what you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are issues that me and Bo usually talk about on our podcast with Running Light, because we talk about issues of sexuality and things to that nature. And so in those sermons, I take the idea of feminism, the idea of the maternal instinct and motherhood in general, and I look at it through a biblical lens. Like, what can we understand about motherhood from a biblical lens? Because so much of our not only understanding but treatment of issues like that comes through a cultural lens. So we're brought up in a particular venue, a particular ideal that we discover together as a community, and then we kind of transpose that on the Bible. And actually, I didn't get into that this much in the sermons themselves, but even in the Bible, you see this happen. So you see people in the Bible treat women pretty poorly, even though the Bible itself doesn't tell these guys to do it. So you see, for instance, polygamy practice in the Bible. You see people rape women in the Bible. There's a lot of mistreatment of women within the biblical context, but it's never written as like this is great. It's written as this is what's happened. And in the sermons, I also pointed back to Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 through 16, where God is basically sending down the curses upon the serpent, the woman, and Adam for eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent is obviously Satan. And there's this really interesting section where he says that Satan will have enmity with the woman. So right there in the beginning of the Bible, you see that Satan has a specific hatred for women that he doesn't necessarily hold towards men. It's not that he really thinks that men are too great, but he hones in and specifically tempts the woman. And then afterwards, God declares that he's going to have enmity with the woman. And then throughout the Bible, you see Satan specifically attack women. You see it in Daniel chapter 11. I quoted a passage where the Antichrist is said to not regard the desire of women. Satan is seen as being one trying to oppress the maternal figure in the book of Revelation chapter 12, which me and you are going to talk about on Wednesday. So you see this really interesting thread throughout the scriptures that Satan specifically seems to really dislike women. And because of that, the cultures of men tend to bend away from treating women well and motherhood in general.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we live in a culture that really doesn't I would say speaks highly of treating women well, but really what you brought out in some of your sermons was that what's happening in the culture through third wave feminism and present day feminism, and whether it's gender studies or all these different things, it's not really helping women. It's actually annihilating them.
Right.
And I thought that was a really interesting point.
That's right. So most cultures in the world, when we talk about like the patriarchy and stuff like that, what we mean is that these cultures see the feminine and despise it and try to annihilate and try to oppress it, subjugate it. Our culture is unique in that we deny the feminine, we deny the motherhood and the maternal ability of women. And so instead of oppressing women, we're actually erasing them. We're treating them as if they do not exist.
Yeah.
And this all started, I quoted this in my sermon, it started with a woman named Simone de Beauvoir, who literally said that women cannot be allowed to take on the role of mother, because if they do, we'll never become equal with men in the workplace.
Right. They saw that really a woman's value was actually seen in her ability to produce like men. And then they missed something very important, right? They missed something that how women lay down their life, how women sacrifice. And they looked at all of women in history that have sacrificed themselves through raising children and taking care of homes and taking care of and trading and their farm crops and all the business that women have laid down their life for, their family businesses and everything. And they kind of totally said, well, whatever to that.
Yeah.
And they say,
It's
well,
not important.
that's not that important. What's important is that this person, a woman, is able to be a CEO,
Right.
like a man.
Right.
And that's where she becomes super valuable
Right.
in the culture. And what they just never really realized is they were eliminating the feminine.
Right. And you point this out in your book too,
Right.
Born a Pastor, where you talk about how when we talk, even the word woman is what? That she has a
Womb.
she has a womb, you know?
Yeah.
And so when you erase that and you erase the womb part of woman, what are you left with? Just a man.
That's
you know?
right.
There's no distinction in gender anymore.
That's right. And that's what the culture's trying to do. And doing something that's impossible, right? Because when, you can't, a 3 is not a 2 and a 2 is not a 5.
Right.
And no matter how much we would like to think, and I would love to think in math class, I would love to have been able to tell my teacher, like, hey, man, I don't know if the numbers matter much.
It's all relative.
Wouldn't that have been a cool answer?
I have a strong feeling the answer is 7.
Like,
that's all that
that's
matters.
right. And they go, well, it's not. And I go, well, we can change that other number and make it a 7, right? But it wouldn't have worked because there was an objective reality.
Right.
Well, there's an objective reality here too, right? But if we are taking out the objective reality and we say there is no objective reality, then really what you just said is not even objective reality too.
Right.
So anything anybody says at that point, meaning it doesn't matter what you say
Right.
at that point, it is all non-objective.
Right.
It is all subjective. It's all arbitrary reasoning.
Right.
Meaning it's reasoning not based on anything solid, any kind of, let's say, foundation, any straight line.
Yeah.
It is based on a line, or not even a line, but it just say a windy road, right?
Right. And
It's
I was
arbitrary.
Exactly. I was really actually thinking through that point this week, because with the potential overturning of Roe versus Wade, people have commented on it that all of a sudden everyone's a biologist, and we're now saying that it's a war against women. Now, the reason why they're saying everyone's a biologist is because very famously just a month ago, when they were confirming the new Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who everyone's hailing as the first black female Supreme Court Justice, she was asked on the bench what a woman was, and she said, well, I'm not a biologist, so I can't answer that. So that's kind of how far we've gone. But now everyone's saying that this is a war on women. So a month ago, we couldn't define what a woman was unless you're a biologist. And even then, you can't define what a woman is. And now everyone's saying that it's a war on women because specifically this attacks women. And there was a New York Times article that came out last week, too, that was like, well, in areas where we're talking about transgenderism, we say birthing persons. But in areas when we're talking about abortion, it's important that we say mothers and women's rights. And I was just like, that's so interesting that they can see the contradiction and say, we don't care. And I was trying to figure out, how can you do that? How can you have these two very contradictory points in your head at the same point? Is it just manipulation? Is it straight up deception? What is this? And I learned just 2 days ago that Karl Marx didn't just have an economic theory. He actually had an entire philosophy about mankind. And one of the things that he said about human nature is he says that we are conscious observers. And what he meant by that is he doesn't just mean that we have consciousness and we're able to see things. What he meant is that human beings uniquely can shape the world through our consciousness. So we could observe things, imagine things, and put them into the reality. Now, this is where it gets a little squirrely. What he says is that, therefore, if we want the world to become more human and less natural, which he saw as a good thing, we need to actually fight nature and just imagine a better world. So in other words, anything that's natural, like a woman has a womb, therefore it just makes logical sense that she could be a mother. His idea was, if we want her to become even more human, we actually deny the natural order and we imagine the world as we want it to be, and then it's becoming better.
And what's so funny is, can anybody not can people not see the narcissism in what Karl Marx was saying?
Yeah,
is like, okay, let's get rid of the natural. Let's get of what's normal, what's objectively, naturally or what's in nature, what's seen every day in nature. Let's get rid of that and let us, let us, who's the us? Let this group, let the misinformation team, decipher, what the right context is and what words to use in that context.
Right.
And, and we'll make our own world. Well, who's the us making the world? That's it. And I think, what it comes down to, in a lot of ways is that we are, the Bible says that we are blind, deaf, dumb, mute, disobedient, go astray. The Bible teaches that we are so separated from God. And that's why God is not present with us right now, is that it's not that there's nothing in the world that can shine God. No, there are things in the world that show the work of God and his handiwork. But there is a blindness that has happened to us as human beings. Our sins are so rooted in us, and the selfishness, and that you can't see it. You literally cannot see it. And I've been there before in my life where, you think you're doing the right thing and you think you're on the right team, and you're trying to supposedly help people out.
Right.
But you're just so blind, and you're so fearful too. You don't want to listen to anybody else because you don't want to be wrong. Being wrong is what everything in your world is being set up to not go in that direction. And so the worst thing you could do as kind of a secular atheist is be wrong.
Right.
And or just a secularist.
Right.
Even if you're a religious humanitarian, is to be like, no, maybe the electric cars aren't going to help everything.
Yeah.
Maybe you go on TED Talk and you listen to people talk about electric, especially like solar panels and stuff like that, and they'll tell you that, man, it's going to create more of a havoc in the natural world.
Right. Even Elon Musk. The dude who has the biggest company that produces them will say that. Yeah.
Right. And you're like, oh my heavens, that's great.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's just a giant train wreck. But, I know in my life, I built up so many areas in my life where I just, and it was all to prevent me from having to see that maybe I'm wrong and see the falsities of my life and of my philosophy. But isn't that crazy that you bring up that point of how it seems so obvious, right? It's like 1 week they write about, hey, we need to be, we have to check our pronouns,
right,
and how we're calling people. And then the next week, it's like, hey, woman, let's use woman. So kind of a confusing world. It'll drive us insane.
Right.
But
and that's kind of like, that was Marx's point, is that this was the way that humanity would evolve, is that, like, when you ask, well, who's doing it? Well, in Marx's view, the people that agreed with Marx should be the ones. So in Marx's view, he's like, it doesn't matter if I'm contradictory.
Right.
It just matters that I have power.
That's right.
Because I am setting the world right.
That's right. As long as you have enough people that are with you in your madness, it can, and you have the power to administrate, the stuff you want to do in the world, then, it can seem like $1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why people drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah. No, you're right. And that's why, Christianity is so beautiful. One of the main passages in the Bible is, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. So there's this idea of, as Christians, where, do we have the revelation of God? Yeah. And we should be humbled by that, and we should always seek it. But you know what? There's a lot we don't know.
Yeah.
And if you think you know everything, you don't know anything, right? The more you recognize your foolishness, the more you recognize your inability to understand nature, the more you're going to press into God, and you're going to seek to understand things in humility. But the more you think, no, I got it all together, I got it all figured out, the more you actually don't, and you're probably going to make a mess of your life and anyone that is underneath your power.
Yeah, there's many passages in the Bible like that. I think of the New Testament, there's a passage that says, have no confidence in the flesh. And I think of Jeremiah 17, verse 5, cursed is the human who trusts in humans and makes humans his strength.
Right.
You know, and, you know, because our hearts do fall apart. And, you know, what makes one person's, you know, what they think better than another person and what they think.
Right.
It really has to do with, you're right, power.
Right.
You know, who is in power. And right now we are definitely in a 1984 Orwell playbook.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that's coming out with the administration seems to be right out of the book. Yeah. It's almost like someone's reading it and just kind of going, hey, you know what? Orwell had some pretty cool thoughts here.
And it is funny because, you know, obviously George Orwell, who wrote 1984, he knew a lot about Marxism.
Yeah.
And the book is not, he couldn't get himself to really condemn Marxism, but he really was against communism. And the party in 1984, they have a theory called doublethink. And it's the capacity to hold two contradictory theories in your head at the same time. And at the end, he's talking to this guy named O'Brien, who's like one of the head dudes. And he's like, it doesn't matter if 2 + 2 = 4 or 5. All that matters is we have the power and we say what it is.
That's right.
You know,
and that's what's happening with the LA Times article, and how they switch gears at different times, right?
Right.
1 minute you can say this, 1 minute you can't say this, 1 minute we are talking about the feminine, and we are really on hyper alert about the femininity of a female having a womb, and then the next minute we're being condemned for talking about that.
Right.
And so, and that's a very double speak kind of point of view.
Absolutely. So as Christians, as we go about the current day to day, I think a couple passing thoughts as we wrap up this subject. Number one, don't let it get you to the cynical place where you're just like, the world is just terrible. It's lost. I'm done trying to talk to people.
Yeah. And it's always been.
Right. It's always been lost. It's always been a mess. There's every philosophy of man goes apart from the gospel. That's what Paul says in the book of Galatians when Peter's getting a little on his high horse through Judaism. He's like, even we had Judaism, that's great, but even we need the gospel, Peter. There is no philosophy of man that touches God. So we need to be very humble about that. We need to understand, again, as Paul's speaking, he says, knowing that such were some of you. Like you were in that same kind of category, and God has saved you out of it. So try not to get too cynical, too discouraged, too vengeful against the culture around you.
Yes.
And hone in on, understand that the truth of the Bible is so simple. You know, one of the things that this mentality is trying to convince us of is that every topic, even biology, is super complicated. It's not. Don't let people throw you off and use all this scientific lingo. It's really, really, really simple. If you, they had this bell curve, which I thought was really funny that they put out online. And on one side of the bell curve, it was like the totally uneducated dude who's just on the beach or like in the trailer park, and he's saying things like, oh yeah, men are men, women are women, and everything he's saying, they're like, it's so simple but it's all true. And then on the peak of the bell curve is like the Cambridge, Oxford graduate person who's like highly intellectual, and they're like, well, actually, you know, there is no such thing as women, and there is no such thing as, it's a spectrum. And then as you go down to the final end of the bell curve, which is like the masters of the universe, the most intelligent people ever, they're like, no, there's men and women. So it's like the people who are like the genius above all geniuses are like agreeing with the person who is on the other side of the bell curve. And I can't remember. I think it was Louis Pasteur. He once said it was Francis Bacon. He said a little bit of science inclines a man towards materialism, but much learning inclines him back to theism.
Yeah.
So the simple things of the Bible are the true things. Hone in on those, learn them, understand them, and try to communicate in a simple way to those around you. Don't let them distract you with all this type of large vocabulary and stuff like this. It's really simple issues.
Yeah, absolutely.